All right, friends, today we turn our attention to one of the most fascinating and important eras in the history of the Church of the East. We examine its life under Islamic rule, beginning in the 7th century with the Arab conquests and extending through the Abbasid Golden Age, culminating with the eve of the Mongol invasions in the early 13th century. This period is oftentimes misunderstood by many historians in the West. Many assume that Christian life simply had collapsed under the rise of Islam, but rather the opposite becomes true. Under the Arabs, particularly the Abbasids, the Church of the East not only learned how to survive, but rather it flourished. It became one of the most intellectually vibrant Christian communities in the world and most geographically expansive church on the planet. Now, at the center of this extraordinary era stands one of the greatest patriarchs in Christian history, Timothy I, a visionary leader who guided the church with wisdom, with much diplomacy, doctrinal clarity, and great missionary zeal. His patriarchate, which stemmed from 780 to 823, represents the height of the Church of the East's cultural, missionary, and theological achievement by many historians. But now we have to speak of this history in greater detail. Now, when the armies of Islam had swept across the Middle East in the mid 7th century, the Church of the East had already endured 4 centuries under the often hostile rule of the Sasanian Empire. Now, Zoroastrian Persia had never fully trusted its Christian minority, especially after the Roman Empire had become Christian. Christians were routinely denounced as potential collaborators with Rome, and thus could not be trusted as faithful citizens of Persia. Thus, as we remember from our readings, as Cardinal Filoni emphasizes, for many Christians in Mesopotamia, the fall of the Sasanian state was not seen as a tragedy by many, but rather in some ways it was a sigh of comfort. The new Arab rulers were at first more tolerant than the Zoroastrian priesthood and less inclined to persecute Christians simply because of theological differences. If we remember from our last lecture, the Umayyads, for example, the first of the Arab conquerors, were much more interested in taxation rather than conversion. Just a quick recap of our last lecture. Under the early Umayyad Caliphate, from around 661 to 750, Christians were granted the legal status of dhimmis, which meant that they were a protected but subordinate religious community. Yes, they could practice their faith, maintain their churches, run their schools and monasteries, and even participate in public life, so long as they paid their taxes and acknowledged the supremacy of Islam. Now remember, these taxes, the jizya tax, was much heavier than the normal tax, but it was the price you paid for not following Islam, but rather retaining your Christian or Jewish beliefs, right? People of the book, again, granted that religious protection status if you paid your taxes. Now, for the Church of the East, this arrangement was workable. Their church had already been shaped by centuries of marginality, asceticism, intellectual resilience, and they now navigated a new world where subtle diplomacy, linguistic skill, and theological clarity were going to become essential. Now, in 750, everything dramatically began to change when it is that the Abbasid dynasty overthrew the Umayyad Caliphate and moved the imperial capital from Damascus to Baghdad. Baghdad, founded in 762, quickly became the intellectual, commercial, and cultural heart of the Islamic Empire of the Abbasids. Now, this shift was immensely fortunate for the Church of the East. Syriac-speaking Christians, already fluent in Greek, Persian, and Aramaic, became central to the Abbasid translation movement, which sought to recover, translate, and transmit the scientific, philosophical, and medical knowledge of the ancient world. Christian scholars translated Aristotle, Hippocrates, and numerous other Greek scientific texts into Syriac and then into Arabic. They staffed the hospitals, they served as physicians to the caliphs, and advised on many administrative matters as well as cultural matters. The Church of the East had become a kind of a bridge of civilization, linking the intellectual world of the Greeks and the Syriacs with the emerging Islamic civilization. Christians were also active in what's called the House of Wisdom that was founded in Baghdad. This diverse amount of groups that were working, whether Christians, Jews, and Arabs, working with each other and contributing to ensure that Greek philosophy entered the intellectual life of the Arabs, shaping thinkers like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, and later Ibn Sina. In this environment, the Church of the East reached extraordinary prominence politically, intellectually, and religiously. One thing we also have to remember is that the Church of the East the patriarch had always resided in Babylon, right? And so now in Seleucia Ctesiphon, and now in Baghdad, which was not too far, and so they had easy connections with the imperial capital now, and so now we're able to, on a greater scale, to be able to collaborate and to speak and have a greater relationship with the Abbasid caliphs. Now, there is no figure that embodies this era more completely than Mar Timothy I, the Catholicos Patriarch of the Church of the East from the year 780 to 823. His 43-year reign is one of the longest and most consequential in the entire history of the Church of the East. Now, a little of a background for Timothy. He was educated in the grade school of Beth Lapat and possessed outstanding linguistic, philosophical, and theological abilities. Even before becoming patriarch, he served as a bishop and was known for his diplomatic skills. His election was not without controversy, and some notes that some rival bishops had challenged him at the synod that elected him, but once in office, he proved to be a very unifying and visionary leader. Now, Timothy I enjoyed an unusually close relationship with the Abbasid court, especially with Caliph al-Mahdi. The Caliph admired Timothy I for his intellect, his composure, his eloquence, and Timothy was regularly invited to the palace for dialogue. Now, one of the most important documents from this period is the dialogue between Patriarch Timothy I and Caliph al-Mahdi, preserved in the original Syriac as well as the Arabic. Now, in this very remarkable exchange, Timothy I defends the Christian doctrines of the Trinity and the Incarnation with rational clarity and calm diplomacy. He avoids polemics and uses philosophical arguments that is comprehensible to Muslim scholars. For example, he tells the Caliph, let us discuss these matters of religion with peace and not with contention. This attitude reflects the Church of the East's long-standing approach to interreligious life, right? Respectful, intellectual, and non-confrontational, and wise, while always maintaining a focus on the truth of Christianity. Okay, if you remember a couple of weeks ago, I assigned the reading of the dialogue between Timothy I and Caliph al-Mahdi, and it's one that I think really deserves to be recognized just a little bit throughout this lecture. It was an optional reading, but I think if you read it, you really see the brilliance of Timothy and how it is that he was able to secure autonomy for the Church of the East. He was able to dialogue very fruitfully with Muslims, and yet at the same time to preserve the truth of Christ and never compromising that truth, right? Timothy's approach, if we see this work, was very remarkable for its lack of polemic, right? He presents Christianity as a reasonable, coherent, and compatible with philosophical monotheism, and his method really conveys the clarity, rationality, and dialogue that is rooted in Scripture, but is expressed philosophically. Now, if you see how this dialogue is set up, it's non-confrontational. His repeated invitation to discuss with peace and not contention really sets the tone for the rest of the work. There's a mutual respect that happens. Right? Timothy acknowledges the truth in Islam and monotheism and reverence for Christ, while also clarifying the doctrinal differences between the two religions. There's a philosophical language that happens where it is that he uses terms that are going to be familiar to Islamic theologians, and he appeals to reason. He argues from a metaphysical principle, the unity of God, divine word, divine wisdom. He also defends the Trinity. Timothy frames the Trinity as necessary for the expression of God's perfection, right? For example, God must be eternally wise. He must be eternally living. Therefore, he possesses the eternal spirit and the eternal wisdom. He emphasizes the unity, not three gods, but one God expressing his own attributes in distinct ways. And he's going to use analogies that are going to be familiar to early Islamic philosophers. What he does is that he presents Jesus as the union of divine word and human nature without compromising the divine transcendence, the divine being of Jesus. What he does is he argues the incarnation as an act of divine generosity, the word entering the history to lead humanity to truth, right? Um, while at the same time, while explaining the nature of Christ, he displays a sensitivity towards Islamic beliefs. He avoids attacking Muhammad, focusing instead on clarifying Christian teaching. He acknowledges the shared reverence for Jesus while explaining the Christian belief in his divinity, and he carefully distinguishes Christian doctrine from the misconceptions that many Islamic polemics are going to throw claims that Christians, what they believe, and all those things, and make those common misconceptions. There's going to be the political skill is going to be very apparent in Timothy's writing, in which he demonstrates the political intelligence. Right, he maintains Christian integrity without offending the caliph. He also shows loyalty to the caliphate, and he demonstrates and emphasizes that Christians will be productive and peaceful citizens of the caliphate. As a result, Timothy is able to secure the ongoing autonomy of the Church of the East, allowing it to work and to expand not only in the caliphate but also beyond the borders of the caliphate and throughout Asia. And this is what is going to play to the brilliance of Timothy I, that he's able to, again, to work out these relationships so that it is that he can have the church flourish and thrive even beyond the borders of the caliphate. Now, the impact of the dialogue is that it really strengthened Christian-Muslim relations during a critical period, at a time when it is that the church was trying to figure out its way under this new regime. It now was able to operate much more freely, and it strengthened those ties to allow it to do so. There was an enhanced respect for the Church of the East throughout the Abbasid world, and it was preserved in both Syriac and Arabic sources, which is evidence of how significant this work was. Now, why this matters for understanding the Church of the East, because we need to know that the intellectual sophistication of the Church of the East's theological tradition reveals how it is that Christians are able to survive within Islamic empire, but not only survive, but now thrive, and it demonstrates why it is that Timothy was considered one of the greatest patriarchs of the Church of the East, and one of the most notable figures in early medieval Christianity. Now, Timothy I was not only a diplomat, but also a great internal reformer. He reorganized dioceses across Persia, Mesopotamia, Arabia, India, and Central Asia, and he insisted that bishops and monks be properly educated. He implemented canonical reforms that strengthened clerical discipline and clarified church law. He promoted theological study, including the works of Theodore of Mopsuestia and the Antiochian tradition. And some of his letters to this day still survive, providing insight into pastoral questions, ranging from monastic discipline into conflicts among bishops. Now, perhaps the most astonishing aspect of Timothy I's patriarchate is the missionary expansion that he coordinated. Now, under his leadership, the Church of the East reached the widest geographical extension of the Christian church before it was that the Jesuit missions came into existence and the Jesuits and the Catholic Church began to operate, for example, within China and throughout Asia. He sent bishops and missionaries to India, to Tibet, to China, the steppes of Central Asia, the Caspian Sea, and the shores of the Persian Gulf. There is a monument that was made in 781, the Nestorian stele of Xi'an, which commemorates the flourishing of Christianity in China during this era. It was written in Chinese and Syriac and records how Christian monks, who were called the luminous ones, the ones of light, or Jingzhao, had evangelized the empire since 635 and continued to do so under the direction of the Catholicos in Mesopotamia. In India, the bishops of the Church of the East continued to ordain clergy for the St. Thomas Christians of the Malabar coast, and the Patriarchate of Timothy I had strengthened these ties. We see under the leadership of Timothy I an overseeing of intellectual flourishing in biblical commentaries that are being written, treatises on theology, canonical collections, letters, interreligious dialogue, scientific and philosophical translations, a period that also saw the church's deep involvement in the translation movement, which produced bilingual scholars who shaped the broader Islamic intellectual world. Thus, Timothy I's patriarchate stands as a high point in Christian Muslim relations, missionary activity, and theological development. Now, after 43 years of reigning and guiding the Church of the East, after it is that Timothy I passes away in 823, we see the church does remain influential, but cracks slowly begin to appear. Now we see that the Abbasid Caliphate began to weaken. There were regional tribes like the Buyids and the Seljuk Turks that began to seize power. Baghdad had begun to lose its central authority, and local rulers had varied widely in tolerance towards Christians. Some caliphs continued to support the Christian elite, others imposed heavier taxation and restrictions, and the environment just became much more unpredictable for Christians in the caliphate. Now, internally, the Church of the East also had its own struggles, and despite its vast geography, it lacked strong centralized administration. Distant dioceses, especially, for example, in Central Asia and China, began to drift away or lose contact, and competition among bishops for the patriarchal throne had begun to increase, with some patriarchs who were elected with political interference, which ended up weakening the authority even further. Now, during this time period, we see that Christian communities still existed along the Silk Road in places like Merv, Nishapur, Samarkand, Kashgar, Outer Mongolia, and we see that Syriac tombstones from Kyrgyzstan and Western China still attest to the presence of the Church of the East well into the 12th and even early 13th centuries. But the unity and the vitality of the missionary network had begun to really wane and weaken. Communication had begun to slow, and clergy became scarce in remote regions. Some communities even became isolated enclaves, unable to maintain full sacramental life and communion with the church. Now, as we approach the early 13th century, the eve of the Mongol invasions, we find the Church of the East in a very interesting and somewhat paradoxical situation. It remained, on the one hand, immense in geographical scope, with communities stretching from northern Mesopotamia through Persia, Central Asia, all the way towards China. Yet, at the same time, it had become very fragile in structure, lacking the internal cohesion needed to sustain such a wide network. Now, what was a blessing at this time was that the core strength of the Church of the East remained its traditional heartland in northern Mesopotamia. Places like Mosul, Marmete, and the other monasteries that were scattered across the Nineveh plain continued to serve as vibrant spiritual and intellectual centers. Now, these monasteries preserved liturgical traditions, theological commentary, and clerical training, even as other regions had begun to face instability. Despite, again, political upheavals, Christian communities persisted in Persia along major Central Asian trade routes. As I had mentioned before, cities like Merv, Nishapur, Samarkand, and Kashgar retained Church of the East populations. And archaeological evidence shows us this, especially in the Syriac tombstones that were found, to have, again, maintained an active Christian identity in these cities well into the 12th and the early 13th centuries. Now, while it was weakened compared to earlier centuries, monastic schools still functioned. They preserved biblical commentaries, canon law, and preserved the Antiochean theological tradition, and these centers served again as the intellectual backbone of the church. Now, even in decline, the church still had a respected role in Islamic society. Christian physicians, astronomers, translators, administrators, philosophers still contributed to Persian and Central Asian courts. Thus, the Church of the East retained cultural influence even as its missionary momentum had begun to slow. So we spoke in the last slide about the strengths, right? The geographical spread, the surviving monasteries, the enduring theological legacy of the Church of the East. But now we have to speak of the vulnerabilities during this time, around again the 13th century. During this time, the powerful and relatively tolerant Abbasid Empire of Timothy's era no longer existed in the same form. Political fragmentation meant that Christians were subject to the whims of the local rulers. However, it is that ruler felt that day about Christians is the type of treatment that Christians were going to receive. Some regions had remained peaceful, while others imposed restrictions, more taxes, or outright hostility towards Christians. There was a declining monastic discipline. Over time, monastic rules were not observed with the same rigor, and we see fewer prominent theologians, fewer major commentaries, and a general weakening of the spiritual formation. And this had ripple effects on the quality of clergy throughout the church. A time of renewal was needed, a time of change was needed. The Church of the East had inconsistent leadership. Patriarchal elections in this period were often contentious. Political interference and rival factions created unstable leadership, and this instability made it difficult for the church to coordinate long distance dioceses effectively. For example, there was a loss of contact with China, especially after the collapse of the Tang dynasty in around 907, whereas that China became more closed off to foreign religions, and the Church of the East communities in China had become isolated. By 1200, communication with them was minimal or non existent, leaving these communities vulnerable and spiritually unsupported, where they just ended up fizzling out. But in many places in China, Christianity was not reintroduced until around 300 years later under the Jesuit missions. There was increased nomadic raids on the Silk Road, tribal warfare, shifting alliances. Raids had destabilized the trade routes, and when trade routes are no longer safe, it becomes harder to travel, it becomes harder to transmit information. And so Christian monasteries, which had relied, for example, on merchants and travelers for communication and supplies, they found themselves cut off, and some outlying Christian communities, as a result, had collapsed simply from isolation. Now, some historians describe the Church of the East at this time as having a very vast but thin network, right? It covered an extraordinary distance but lacked infrastructure. It lacked clergy, resources, internal communication, and as effect was not able to sustain unity and vitality. In many ways, the Church of the East was a church that was stretched to its limits. Yet, despite these vulnerabilities, we cannot think of the Church of the East during this time as being lifeless. Not at all. It remained adaptive. It was culturally embedded, and spiritually, it was vibrant in many regions and in many ways. But what is crucial to know, and very interesting to note during this time period, is that several Mongol clans had already had exposure to the Church of the East, whether through intermarriage, whether through trade, or whether through the missionary presence that was constantly present in Central Asia. Now, this means two things of the Mongols that they would bring in the coming age, and that we'll talk about more in the next lecture. That yes, devastation would happen to many Christian cities and Christian centers and Christian populations throughout Asia. This was part of the consequences of the Mongolian invasions, right? If they approached a gate of a city and the city refused to open up to the Mongols, and if they had to siege the city, then they would have no mercy when it is that they did take the city, and they would sometimes just kill off the entire population of the city. So, while it did bring devastation to many Christian populations throughout Asia, it also presented new possibilities. And again, as some of the Mongol leaders were sympathetic or even connected, or even Christians themselves, to the Church of the East, right? So they had this connection to the Church of the East. But again, that story belongs to our next lecture. Now, from the 7th to the 13th centuries, the Church of the East lived through one of the most dynamic and consequential periods of its history. Under Islamic rule, especially under the Abbasid Caliphate, we see how the church had rose to prominence as a center of scholarship, a center of theology, a missionary powerhouse, a translational powerhouse, a church of dialogue, a church of truly global Christian communion that spread throughout Asia. And we see how it is that the Patriarchate of Timothy I had stood out as a pinnacle of this legacy, a moment when the church's intellectual, missionary, and diplomatic brilliance had really shone across Asia. But most of this time period, we see how it is and why it is that Cardinal Filoni writes that the Church of the East during this era was a heroic church that bore the faith of its fathers with great courage, with great intelligence, and great hope. Its story in this period is one of creativity, endurance, adaptability, and astonishing reach. And in our next lecture, we will see how the coming of the Mongols brought, yes, both devastation, but also unexpected new horizons for this ancient church. We'll see you next time.